I want you to do some imagining with me. Imagine for a second that you are going through a trial. Actually, I probably should clarify right away. When I say a trial, I don't mean like my internet went out for 3 days. How long, oh Lord, will I have to endure this? This must be what it felt like to be Jonah. Not that kind of trial. I'm talking about like a criminal trial. Imagine you are going through a criminal trial. You have been charged with something, and now you are being tried in a courtroom. You can also, if you'd like to, you can go ahead and imagine that you're innocent as well. If you'd like, realistically, I've seen some of y'all drive. I don't know if you're all innocent, but it's your imagination. So go ahead and imagine that you are innocent in this particular case, that there is a prosecutor who, for whatever reason, has taken a real aggressive approach to you, is now pursuing you with unjust charges, something that you did not do. So now you're at the courthouse. You're in the hallway. You're waiting outside the courtroom. You're waiting to meet your attorney so that you can go in together and receive the verdict on your case. And you are stressed. You know that you're innocent, but you've seen this prosecutor in this case over the course of the trial take your words and twist them, take them out of context, paint you as the criminal, and so you are just wondering, what is the jury going to believe here? You're maybe even kind of mentally preparing yourself for a guilty verdict, even while you're still trying to hold on to some hope. And if you're a praying person, and even if you're not sometimes, this is the kind of moment when you turn to God and you say, God, I could really use some help here. I could use some mercy in this moment. So you're waiting, you're praying, you're stressing. Imagine that there is this television up in the corner, just kind of in the background without any sound, playing the news. You're not really paying attention to it until suddenly you see this image, this video on the screen. It's a video of the prosecutor in your case. Your prosecutor there on the television being led away in handcuffs by the police. And there's a scroll across the bottom that says corruption charges filed against local DA. And now you don't know what to think. You're freaking out. You're trying to figure out what is going on here. What does this mean? I don't know exactly what this means, but it sounds like it might be a good thing, right? Maybe you get a new trial. Maybe this whole case gets thrown out. Maybe this is the very answer to the prayer that you were praying. My God, the Lord, this is amazing. My Redeemer lives. I'm telling you, that series of church was right. A different world is possible. You're celebrating, and this excitement is rising up in you. And as it is, you get a call, a phone call from your attorney's office. And it's your lawyer's secretary on the phone, saying to you in a panic that your attorney's office has just been raided by the FBI, and your lawyer has been detained for questioning. Well, now you have no idea what any of this means. Now you're at a total loss, and you are sitting in this hallway, stunned. And you hear, as you're sitting there trying to process this, other people around you murmuring and talking loudly. And you hear, what you overhear them saying, is this rumor that's been going around that the judge in your case has just resigned. And so now you are jumping in on this conversation. All of you are trying to figure out what is happening, and everyone is just talking loudly, and suddenly one of the courthouse police officers comes over and says to you in a loud voice, "Can I have your attention, please? The governor of Connecticut has ordered the judicial operations of New Haven County to be suspended indefinitely. You all need to leave this building and go home. You will be notified when something changes." What is going on? Is this the Lord at work? I mean, is this what the Lord is doing to intervene? You were praying for something, but you just kind of meant like, Lord, let me be found innocent, not like, let's overthrow the whole government. What do you even make of all of this? We are continuing right now with this series leading us from Easter to Pentecost, as Josh mentioned, a series called The Different World is Possible, where we have been talking about the transformative work of God in our lives now in relation to the hope that we have for a whole world transformed by the return of God to dwell with us. And as we are trying to imagine this different world, one of the questions we have to wrestle with is this: how different are we prepared for the world to be? Is this different world that is possible, is it a little bit different? Or is it a lot of bit different? We probably all wish the world would be a little bit different, that we would be found innocent according to its rules, but are we prepared for it to be a lot different? And how do we even go on living then in relation to a world that is a lot different? How do we know what to do? It can leave us feeling confused. I don't know what to make of this. This different world is so different that it's a little unsettling. Maybe it's even frightening. But it might be very good. It might be better than I ever imagined. And so we're going to read through a passage from the Gospel of Luke today, where the people in Jesus' hometown receive directly from Jesus a vision of a different world. But they kind of miss it, because they don't seem ready to trust that with this Jesus in front of them, the world can be a lot different. So let's pray together, and then we'll read some scripture. Come, Holy Spirit, and form us into the audience right now for the word that you have to say to us. A word from you, not from me. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So this is the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, beginning in verse 16. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." So let's start here for a second with something pretty obvious, but it's worth saying anyways. That Jesus reads this passage from the prophet Isaiah, and he applies it to himself. He describes the mission that he's been anointed or set apart for, and says that because he's on this mission, you can tell that the Holy Spirit is upon him. You know that he works for the God of Israel, who is also all about this same mission. What exactly is it? What has Jesus been anointed for? Well, to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, you all know it's exactly this kind of point. I like to justify all that money that I spent on a seminary education by digging deep. Let's dig deep into these original languages, the Greek, the Hebrew. Let's see what Jesus really means here. So when Jesus uses the word poor, in this context, what he really means is people who don't have a lot of money. And when Jesus talks about the captives, he means like people who are locked up, like in prison. And when Jesus talks about the blind, what he really means is people who can't see. And when Jesus talks about the oppressed, he means those who have been crushed down and forced aside by the powerful. Actually, now that I think about it, you don't really need the Greek. You just need to just read. Just read it. It's just right there. It's the words on the page. We're not first talking about the spiritually poor, or the emotionally captive, or the intellectually blind, or the psychologically oppressed. We are talking about Jesus' anointing to turn his attention and the whole of his ministry towards those living under real material conditions of poverty, imprisonment, physical disability, and oppression. And so Isaiah presents a vision of the life under the reign of God. The same God who sent his Spirit to anoint this Son. And this reign of God includes the undoing, of all of these things. And really, that shouldn't even be the controversial part, either for us or for the listeners in Jesus' synagogue that day. Because the prophets had been saying this for a long time. The prophets had given a lot of warnings about this. It's a very common theme in the Old Testament. The people of God have constantly been tempted to say that the real material poverty around them is just a fact of life. It's just the basic condition of living in this world, that some people have nothing while others are rich. Some people rule while others are ruled. That's just the way God made the world. So why would God's real mission be about something that intends to change that the way that God made the world? The prophets and later Jesus and the New Testament writers all reject that. They reject that repeatedly. The fact that people suffer unequally does not seem to be to them merely a fact of life. It seems to be a travesty, an abomination, a defiance of the God who shows no partiality. So for Jesus' listeners in the synagogue who know their scriptures quite well, it's not really that controversial to just read about Isaiah's vision of a different world. The controversial part is verse 21. When Jesus says, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Jesus is not just claiming that he will initiate this new world, he is claiming that he is doing it already, that life in his presence is synonymous with life under the reign of Israel's God. So for those of us who follow Jesus today, it's probably not too difficult to believe that one day Jesus is the one who will put an end to poverty and oppression. What's controversial is this word in verse 21, today. Today. In what way is this vision of the future not actually entirely about the future? Perhaps it's not something fundamentally intended to be waited for, but a word for today, a word about the very Jesus who is living in our midst now. Let's come back to that thought in just a moment. So even though Jesus seems to be making this pretty bold statement in verse 21, it doesn't quite register with the folks listening to him in the congregation that day in the synagogue. Their response to when he says this is not exactly negative, it just kind of misses the point. It says all of them all spoke well of him, and they were amazed. They were amazed at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son? Wow, is this the boy that we remember, the one from down the block? The carpenter's son? Look at him now, talking like a rabbi. Good for him. He's come a long way." It's the kind of response like that reminds me of like the first time that I preached in front of my grandma. And like I gave a hard sermon, like a really like convicting. Like I was wondering if I was going to come to grandma afterwards and she was just going to be face down, repenting, praying out loud. And I come to grandma and she says, "What a sweet boy. You look so handsome up there. You a big preacher up there. You know what really impressed me? How loud you are." I was like, "Where's my sweet little boy?" "Grandma! No! Grandma! You didn't get it at all. What's it? Grandma wasn't trying to be sweet. I was trying to bring the thunder." Jesus is trying to say something extraordinary. But the crowd and his home congregation, they just don't have the capacity to see him as truly extraordinary. And that seems confirmed in a way by what happens next, that Jesus is sensing something else happening in the room, besides merely that people are marveling at his speaking abilities. He said to them, "Doubtless you will put to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.'" So it seems the rumors about Jesus and his ministry have gone ahead of him, even as he's coming back to his hometown. Rumors about this man who is healing people, who is casting out demons. And so the crowd is really gathering at this synagogue, kind of to see a show. See if what they say about Jesus is true. Come on, Jesus. Enough talking. Let's see some magic tricks. Let's do it. And Jesus' response to that vibe in the room seems almost harsh. He said, "Truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown." But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, except Naaman the Syrian. And in effect, Jesus is not only saying, I'm not going to put on a show for you. He's saying something even bolder than that. My miracles aren't really for you. They're for other people. And suddenly, hearing that, the crowd turns against him very quickly. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through their midst and went on his way. So one question among many here might be this: why doesn't Jesus just do miracles? Why doesn't he just do the miracles? Is he saying that he can't? Is he saying that this is like some kind of, payback for when he was bullied in school? I don't think so. I think the key here is at the beginning of that passage, when he says, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. The people of Nazareth are stuck on an idea of Jesus. This picture that they have of him in their heads as this little boy running through the streets, as this apprentice carpenter who screwed up the first table that he made, he just seems so normal to them. Maybe even if he wasn't always that normal, he just seems familiar. They project onto him the mundane, the everyday. And whatever this actual Jesus in front of them does, it can't quite penetrate this idea that they have of him. They aren't willing to change their minds about it. Even watching Jesus perform miracles, it seems, wouldn't penetrate this mental image that they have of this man from Nazareth. They can receive his miracles as kind of cool or amazing or extraordinary, but they just seem to be unable to receive Jesus' miracles as what they really are, which is a testament that Jesus is the king over everything, the king of the universe. Nazareth is just a little town in the middle of nowhere. The king of the universe isn't just going to be raised down the block. Their idea of who Jesus is and has always been has become an obstacle to engaging with the actual Jesus who's right in front of them. No matter what he does, he's always the same to them. Their idea of him comes first, and so they can't really understand it. And so Jesus says the miracles, they aren't for them, but for people prepared to receive them as the sign that they really are. Miracles are for people more interested in who I really am than who they think that I am. Friends, how many times in our lives has the idea of the Christian life stood as an obstacle between us and simply living with Jesus? The image that we have in our mind of what a Christian looks like has very little to do with the relationship Jesus is calling us to right now. And in fact, in some ways, it can even prevent us from seeking Christ. Maybe you imagine this Christian life as this kind of ever-increasing moral perfection. And you look at your life and you say, I seem to be struggling with some of the same things over and over again. Am I doing this right? Am I even really a Christian? Or maybe you think of the Christian life as a kind of hypocritical moralism. Like, it's just a claim of perfection without any real goodness. That Christianity is just this kind of set of judgments that you are handed, that you get to make about other people. Maybe you imagine the Christian life as this kind of unworldly purity, this total rejection of life in the world in favor of constant prayer and Bible study. And that just sounds kind of boring. Maybe you think of the Christian life as like 5 or 6 different meetings and services and committees each week that you have to attend, and you just don't really have time for it. Maybe you think of the Christian life as actually a pretty nice thing. Like, it's just a nice way for people to make friends, serve a community, get yourself centered. But also, you already have a yoga class and you volunteer every week down at the soup kitchen, so you kind of got that covered. What more do you really need of that? Whatever idea of being Christian that you brought with you today, it's merely an idea. It's not the reality of life with God, which has less to do with conforming to some particular image of a Christian and more to do with learning slowly, day by day, that Jesus is alive, that Jesus is present, that Jesus is powerfully at work in you and in the world, that the kingdom is nearer now than when we first believed. Sophia and I had a friend in South Africa. Her name was Heather. She was a single white woman from California who spent many years living in South African slums, in a particular slum, among rows and rows and rows of 10 shacks. And she didn't just live near them, she lived in a shack like everyone else. In this single room with a dirt floor filled with 7 other people who did everything in that one space. She lived there as a missionary. She lived there as someone who wanted her whole life, and not just her words, to testify to this good news. And her commitment was about as far as you could possibly go in the direction of the kind of living sacrifice that the Bible speaks about. She endured a lot for the sake of the gospel. We even had I was asking, Sophia and I were reflecting back on particular memories about her, and we remembered this. We had another missionary friend from El Salvador who went to visit Heather's shack, and afterwards, I remember coming back and saying, I don't know how she's living like this. I could never, ever do this. Heather was a real example to me, on the one hand, of all the assumptions that I brought with me about Christian life. I assumed that there were just all these things, these aspects of life that were just a given. Here's the career you pursue. Here's the paycheck that you have. Here's the neighborhood you live in. Here's the kind of people you associate with. That's all just a given. Now, given that, how do I figure out how to follow Jesus within that? And Heather was this constant reminder that Jesus doesn't take any of that to be a given. None of those things. That all of that, even down to the most basic necessities of survival, that all of that we might be called to surrender for the sake of following Jesus. But here, I think, to me, was the really interesting thing about Heather. That she was not trying to be just someone's more perfect idea of what a Christian life should look like. She was just following Jesus. And occasionally, when other people would see her life and her example, they would get really defensive about the way that they were living their lives. And they would even kind of go on the attack, questioning Heather's ministry, whether this was worthwhile, whether this was strategic or effective, whether there was maybe even something offensive about this whole arrangement. Heather, she wasn't there to argue with her. Was her ministry effective? I don't know. This is what you mean. Some people were really powerfully moved by the Holy Spirit. But it wasn't like the whole township, the whole system came crashing down. Heather didn't erase the conditions that people were living in. The whole neighborhood doesn't look different. There isn't some big church that she started there. But all of that was secondary to Heather. What mattered was that this was the life that Jesus had called her to. And that fixation on following Jesus also made Heather really incredibly gracious towards the way other Christians were pursuing their own lives and their own ministries. She never set herself up as this kind of ideal. She just kept encouraging everyone around her to ask the Spirit what God was asking of them in their lives. And she was open to the idea that might look something quite different from what she was doing. Heather was like this living example to me of what Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 4, where he says, "It is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. I do not even judge myself. Only Jesus' opinion about Heather's life would count for something. And so just when I was tempted to replace one idea of the Christian life with another, more radical idea, that this, finally I had found that this was the right way to follow Jesus. Here comes Heather, who in her graciousness was ready to undermine even that idea. Even that idea of extraordinary martyrdom was something different from just simply learning to follow Jesus. The world is a big place. It's filled with a lot of opinions. There's a lot of ideas about what life should look like. Probably in your head, you hold together some very conflicting ideas about what life should look like. But you keep living. And the reality of the life you are living, even that, in a sense, is too much for you to fully grasp. What do I mean by that? Well, in one sense, think about that congregation in Nazareth. In one sense, they were almost too close to Jesus to understand him. And at the same time, they were almost too far from Jesus to understand him. They were too close in the sense that they had seen him through this very narrow lens of their experiences of him as a boy. And they couldn't expand their vision. They couldn't see that something bigger was going on. Someone much more extraordinary was sitting in front of them than just the boy that they had known down the block. And in this other sense, they were also too far from Jesus to understand him. They had come to know him, if they could have come to know him as the chosen one of God. They could have seen the kinds of miracles that he was doing in Capernaum if they had gone to Capernaum. They could have also left Nazareth. They could have also followed Jesus. They didn't have to just sit there and wait for him to swing through town to put on a show. At any moment, they could have followed Jesus, and they would have had an entirely different experience of him. But they didn't. They didn't go to where he was going. And so if we want to join Jesus in this mission of bringing good news to the poor, freedom to the captive and oppressed, sight to the blind, we have to admit that in some ways we are also too close and simultaneously too far from what Jesus is doing. We are too close in the sense that we can become so obsessed with our personal experience of transformation that we don't fully acknowledge that whether we experience it or not, our lives have undermined some of our own mission, some of our own testimony. There are huge things at stake for our witness in the very way that we live. And Jesus has something to say about the sins that our lifestyles participate in. Matt pointed out one of those for us last week, one of these huge things, our abuse of the created world. Jesus is freeing the whole world from its bondage to captivity, Romans tells us, and yet we are sometimes acting as its captors. We are too deeply inside our own lives, too deeply close to it to see that. And so there are so many things that we take for granted. So many things we assume to be simply the way that the world is doing things. Just the way the world works. Even while Jesus is actively in the middle of undoing precisely those things. In America, we have never really made any effort to repent of enormous sins undergirding our lives. The forced removal and destruction of Native American tribes, the transatlantic slave trade, an individualist, materialist culture that gives rise to greater and greater inequality. If we don't believe that Jesus has something to say about these things, we should really think harder about why Jesus was scrolling through Isaiah looking for that particular passage to read about himself. And yes, if we want to participate in the mission of Jesus, we will also have to grapple with how we proclaim good news, even at that level, that massive level. And at the same time, we are sometimes just too far away from the places where Jesus is doing very quiet, intimate, powerful work. Josh was just sharing with the staff last week about some ministry he's been doing with inmates in a local prison and the way that they can experience the real freedom of Christ even while they are locked in. And if we don't think that that's possible, If we think that the problem of mass incarceration is only a structural issue, that prisoners don't want to hear anything that isn't directly leading to their physical freedom, then we're not really paying attention to the actual living Jesus. We're more attached to this kind of nice 21st century liberal idea of the kingdom than really participating in the actual kingdom. Is the different world which Jesus is bringing about, is it a little different, or is it a lot different? It is a lot different. It is so different that even the measures by which we judge these things might have to be different. And that can feel very unsettled. How are we supposed to live now in order to be good, in order to follow Jesus? Well, I would suggest to you that we don't really start with a big idea of what this should look like and then try to work our way backwards to the details of how we should live our lives. In fact, this is a much larger discussion we could have at some point, but I'm convinced that that's not really how anyone ever lives their lives, as much as we would like to convince ourselves that we do. Instead, we start very particular with the reality of the choices we make today, about where we spend our time, what we pay attention to, how we open ourselves up to the reality of God's presence in our midst, how we prepare ourselves to hear from God and be completely surprised by what He has to say to us. We are already walking along some path. How do we allow that path to converge with the way of Jesus? Well, one place to start is simply to ask Him for that, to express that desire in your own heart, and to keep expressing that desire over and over again in worship, in prayer, in being confronted by the Jesus of Scripture. We're going to make space for you to do more of that in just a moment here. And if you are already further along this way and you are looking for more examples and more partners and more of Jesus, I would love to talk to you about that. We would love to talk about that. That's what these discipleship opportunities that Josh mentioned earlier are all about. So let me just give you one last story for you to consider. This is just a kind of, in some ways, a small example of turning what it looks like to turn from the idea of Jesus or an idea to the reality of Jesus. So a few weeks ago, George Black and I were sitting on the front steps of his house, and we were just talking. And there was this high school across the street. It was in the afternoon. There was this high school across the street that was letting out all of its students for the day. And a couple of young men, as they were coming into school from across the street from each other, started yelling at each other. Now backpacks and jackets are coming off. A crowd is gathering. Looks like we're about to have a fight happen here. And I say to George, because I know that working with teenagers is a real calling of his, I say to George, so do you have a policy about this kind of situation? And at first he said, my policy is that I'm not anybody's daddy. But then, a fight actually starts, right in the middle of a busy street. And George gets up, and he starts walking towards it. And then suddenly a bunch of kids are jumping in, and somebody goes down, somebody's getting kicked and stomped on. And now George breaks into a sprint and goes crashing into the middle of this group, pulling people apart, and stops the fight. You might think that you have a policy, that the best thing is to work out in advance what to do according to some ethical ideal. But then you're in the middle of it. And then you're in the middle of your life, and where now is Jesus? And what now is the Spirit asking of you? One of the things that's great about George, that I love about George, is that as he's pulling one of his young men to the sidewalk, this young man who very clearly wants to continue fighting, what George is shouting at him in his face is not, hey, you're being really stupid, this is dumb, quit it. Instead, what he's shouting is about worth, and what's worth it, and what's not, and about what makes this young man's life valuable. George understands perfectly well that there is a lot going on here, that yes, there is a personal disagreement between teenagers, but also there is a lot going on here. Much larger problems of value wounding and the hopelessness of marginality and cultures of violence and poisonous ideas about what it looks like to be a man. And he's not using any of those words, but also, when he's shouting, that's exactly what he's talking about. In that moment, it's not that he's trying to just mentally hold together all of these particular theories at so many different levels. It's that he's simply just trying to be the person that Jesus has formed him to be. But he is attentive in that moment to the Holy Spirit, because he has been attentive to the Holy Spirit for a long time. And the real Jesus who is present there, not as idea, but right there in the middle of it all, is on a mission. He's on a mission to the whole world at every possible level. So let me invite up our worship team. Let me invite up the communion servers. We're going to, in just a moment here, take communion together. And when we take communion, when we eat this bread, drink this juice, what we are also celebrating is the reality of Jesus in our midst. And so as we do, I just want to leave you with a few questions to reflect on. What images have you been holding on to of what the Christian life looks like, should look like? In what way is the idea of the Christian life holding you back from the reality of living with Jesus? What's one way that you could express, even this week, your desire to live with the real Jesus? Let's pray together. Lord, we are so grateful to you for your unending love for us. That when we can get confused and deep inside of ourselves and at points don't even know what to pray for ourselves, that your Spirit is alongside of us, crying out, expressing what it is that our hearts need most. Lord, let us listen in to those prayers of the Holy Spirit. Speak to us, Holy Spirit, now about the real needs of our hearts, about your real presence in our midst. Let us come before you to worship and give thanks. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. If you are a follower of Jesus, or if you would like to become one today, to use this as your first expression of your desire to follow Jesus, come on, join us. Take and eat.